Hi, I'm Steve. This is Colin. We're from Number 12 Cider. Thanks for joining us today. So we're going to offer a little primer on selecting apples to make a great cider. So we're going to start with a little bit of the history of apples and their botany. So, because we think it's really important for everybody to understand as much as they can about the apple, so it can make it easier to determine how to find good apples. Basically, apples up until about 100 years ago were almost exclusively grown to make cider, or as some people call it, hard cider, an alcoholic beverage. Colonial America was no exception. In the United States, in colonial days and in the 1800s, it was by far and away the most popular alcoholic beverage. And with them and their possessions, the Europeans that came to North America brought traditional cider apple trees with them. And it resulted in a boom of cider making and apple tree growing in colonial America that is really fascinating. So check that out sometime. Something about the apple that's interesting is the seeds of the apple are not the same as their parent. So a lot of people don't know this, but if you plant an apple seed, you won't get the same apple tree. To get the same apple tree, you have to do something called grafting, which is to clone the apple tree, taking a branch from the tree that you like and attaching it to a branch or a rootstock from a tree that you're growing. Because otherwise, every time you plant a seed, you're basically creating a new kind of apple tree. And that's important. That's important to know for discovering apple varieties. A lot of people might want to send us a picture of an apple and say, hey, what kind of apple is this? We have no idea. There's no way to know. The only way to really know is to know the history of the tree that it came from. And if it's a tree that was grown by an orchard in a row with a bunch of other Haralson apple trees, well, you know it's probably a Haralson. Anyway, so this history is really unique because we have an encyclopedia here that documents all the apple varieties in North America. And I think there's something like, how many apple varieties documented?
16,000 or
16,000.
in that book. 16,000
apple varieties.
But keep in mind that there's more undiscovered apples than there are cataloged. So as many as there sounds like there is, a lot of this process you're talking about of wild seeds planting themselves and becoming a different apple, most of those things haven't been cataloged. So there's a lot of unknown varieties out there that are just waiting to be made into great cider.
So that's what the exciting thing about using apples to make cider. A lot of our viewers don't have the ability to press apples, don't have an apple press, their neighbors don't have an apple press. This discussion is probably not going to help you very much until you get to that point. But for those of you who do have a press or have the ability to blend your own apple varieties, congratulations. You're in for a real fun ride.
The next step beyond that would be intentionally blending your own varieties in a way that makes what you think is going to be great cider. So we want to talk a little bit today about the characteristics of the apples that you're looking for when you decide to make that blend. What exactly goes into it? So trying to keep it simple, we basically have 4 characteristics that you're thinking about. One of which is sugar, probably the most important element. And sugar is going to translate into how much alcohol that becomes when the yeast metabolizes it. So if it's not enough sugar, the cider in the end will be a little bit thin and watery, not very interesting. So you want a certain amount of ABV to capture that nice mouthfeel of a good cider. We also have acid, which usually comes in the form of tartness with apples. And acid adds a certain zing, it adds a certain kind of tartness to the cider that we prefer. Sometimes it can be much for other people, but a level of tartness is always a nice thing to kind of add a little depth to it. The third element you're looking for in an apple would be the tannins. Tannins probably a very mysterious and difficult element to find in apples. More so what you're talking about with the old American apples or old historic apples, there's a lot more tannin with those. Nowadays we're dominated by dessert apples, which generally don't have much tannin. But tannin adds certainly depth and mouthfeel, complexity. It comes in the form of bitterness, which is called a hard tannin. It comes in the form of dryness or astringency, which is called a soft tannin. And those just build interest in your cider, and that's an important element. And then the last element you're looking for is probably the simplest, which is aromatics. And aromatics, certainly kind of sets up the drinker for what's to come. So it's really part of the sensory experience and setting up that sip when you're drinking your hard cider. So you're looking for sugar, acid, tannins, and aromatics. And if you can cover those categories, you're probably in for some good hard cider.
Yeah, so how do you find those categories? We use a couple of instruments for field testing apples. When we're discovering new apple varieties, we use one instrument called a refractometer. Now, we've discussed and used something called a hydrometer in the past, which is a little different instrument. This basically gives you the same information for a fresh apple, though. If you can press a couple of drops of juice onto your refractometer, you can determine the sugar level in the apple. And that's important for deciding whether the apple is ripe, but also important to decide what kind of sugar quantity you're getting from that apple. Is that going to make for a good cider? We generally get apple varieties testing at sugar levels that would yield between 4 and 10% alcohol. And I think as a rule of thumb, the higher the alcohol on that scale, the better it is for the final outcome of the cider. The alcohol is a flavor component, but it also adds to the mouthfeel and other factors. And when you have a high alcohol, it usually means that your apple you've gotten it when it's fully ripe.
So how would you use this? We would use this in the field, so you can literally be out in an orchard picking apples, pull this out of your pocket. You need to get a couple drops of the juice somehow. Usually you can cut a piece off and squeeze it and get a couple drops out. You'll put a drop on the slide, and if you point this to the light, you'll see a scale inside there that would give you the sugar level. So in this case, this one has two scales. It has a specific gravity scale on the right side, and it has a Brix scale on the left side. So I get a feel for where the sugar is on that. And it's very simple and easy.
And both of those are going to tell you the sugar level. Another little tool we use in the field, we have a couple of different options here, but test for the acid level. And when we're testing in the field, we have these really cheap and easy to use pH strips. Really, apples have more than just pH. You can test the total acidity, you can use more fancier instruments, but this pH strip is a very simple, cheap, effective tool to give you a pretty good idea of where you stand with the acid on that apple. Basically, you take this strip, you dip the end in a few drops of the juice, and you let it change color. And when it changes color, you can compare it to the scale, and it'll tell you where on the pH scale that apple juice is coming out. Same thing for a little pH reader that we have. This requires a little more juice, so we often aren't taking this into the field with us. But if you press some of your apple out and get enough juice to dip the end of your pH meter into the juice, you can get a more accurate digital reading of the pH level. And when we're talking about pH for apples, generally those readings come between 2.8, and if you understand pH at all, a low reading means it has a high acid. So a 2.8 is a very, very high acid apple. And everything all the way up to 4.0, which is a very, very low acid apple. Colin and I, when we're making cider, we get apples that are on the low end and the high end of that reading. But when our final juice is ready, when we're ready to ferment the blended juice, we typically are looking for pH in the 3.2 to 3.5 range. Something to keep in mind. Maybe you like it a little different, but I think most people would think a pH level in that range is going to make for a good finished cider product that's not too high and not too low in acid.
So, and then as far as the sugar goes, you know, probably the easiest thing is specific gravity or Brix scale, whatever one you want to use. But we would see apples in specific gravity to be something about 1.040, might be a low end apple as far as sugar levels that we'd want to use. And then we get things we've had things in the specialty apples that are as high as, you know, maybe 1.090 or 1.080. Where it's almost unbelievable how high that sugar is, which translates into a high alcoholic beverage. So those are just some general guidelines that you want to be looking for sugar and acid. As far as tannins go and aromatics, you know, tannins something you can measure in a lab. We don't have the equipment here for that. We just generally go by taste, and you can get used to that too. You can taste the bitterness, you can taste the astringency just by biting into an apple. And then aromatics is pretty self-explanatory. That's just something you'll get with experience. So looking for those characteristics in your ciders is two things you can test, and two things are just from experience probably.
Yeah, and what amount of these things do you want? Generally, if you have a really high acid, you want to balance these things out. So if you have a really high acid apple, you want to balance with a low acid apple. If you have a really high tannin apple, you want to balance it with a low tannin apple. You're looking for a balance that gives you a good balanced flavor in the finished product.
So Annie Prue, I should introduce her at this point. She has a great book called Cider. And in her book, she talks about a guideline for people that are blending their own apples or their own juice of what do you think about when you're doing that. Because now you're not buying the store-bought juice anymore where you don't know what goes into it. Now we're specifically picking apples, making juice, and blending those things from each one to make a good product. So she talks about a really nice guideline of, she starts with a neutral base of apples, right? So that'd be something that's not overly high in any of those categories, just kind of a neutral, mild, good apple to eat, neutral base. And she would say 30 to 60% of your final juice should be in that neutral base category. She goes on to talk about how maybe if a tartness or an acid level, you want to do about 10 to 20% of your final blend would be apples that satisfy that tartness. Another 10 to 20% could be a tannic apple. And then finally another 10 or 20% could be your aromatic qualities. So some apples overlap several of those categories, or you might just have a really high tannic apple that's really bitter, and it's going to satisfy mostly just the tannic component. So as you're blending and thinking about what am I putting together here, you want to satisfy those elements in that framework to get that final blend that kind of checks all the boxes and has a nice balanced blend in there.
How do you find these apples? Good luck, you know. Start asking around, look at trees. You pick apples that are growing on your property, taste them, test them, try making cider out of them. A couple of apple varieties that are commonly available that in our area that you know, because most of the growers here are growing these what Colin called the dessert apples, these table apples that are kind of neutral. Where do you get apples with tannin? One of the varieties that we've been able to find here is called the Dolgo Crabapple. Dolgo Crab is a small apple that a lot of the orchards grow for pollination, and they have really high tannin. They also have really high acid and really high sugar, so you have to understand that when you're using it and not, you know, make just a Dolgo product. Another apple that we've found growing around here from time to time is called the Hewe crab, also known as the Virginia crab. It was a very common apple in the 1800s, so occasionally you find that growing on some of the orchards that have some of the old trees left. Beyond that, you kind of have to do your own investigation to see what's growing in your area. Maybe you have a grower that does have some bittersweet apple varieties like, you know, Dabinett or Yarlington Mill growing on their property.
So as an example of what we're talking about, let's just talk about the champagne apple right now. This is a apple that was found in Wisconsin that we, only one orchard has it, they've trademarked it. We've been privileged enough to use it in one of our ciders. And this is a fantastic apple in many of those categories, but it does not have tannin. So very high sugar, ends up about 8% alcohol. It's got great aromatic qualities, kind of this tropical banana thing, grapefruit going on. It has fairly low acidity, so we know that the cider would be not very tart in the end, which is fine. You want to have a range of things, but no tannins. So we blended this with another apple called Dabinett, which we procured from one of our orchard friends, and that's a high tannin apple. So we took the missing element of this apple, which was tannins, we added another tannic component to it, and in the end it became this nice balanced cider with the two elements kind of joined together. So that's kind of the intention, is, you know, checking the boxes, a little bit of tannin, a little bit of acid, a little bit of sugar, or actually a lot of sugar, and some aromatic qualities. And then in the end, it may not be perfect in the end, but it may be better than you think. And it's a lot more fun to think about sort of all these characteristics and how you can, you know, go from one to another to create a final blend that's delicious.
The exciting thing about using apples, as Colin and I often say, the two biggest determinants of your outcome for cider is the kind of apples you use and the kind of yeast you use. We'll get to a discussion about yeast, but it's very exciting to try different apple blends, and we wish you the best of luck making your own cider.